Good morning, friends. Early this morning, as I was putting together this study on how to study the Bible and how to teach the Bible, the thought occurred to me about putting together a series of audio or video messages for my Sunday school groups. Beside the Bible teaching ones, I thought maybe a study in the book of First John might be a really interesting way to go. Several years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I started to put together a book on First John. I called it Walking in the Light. And I don't have any reason to change that title because I think it describes the direction I want to go with this book. So this morning, as I was thinking about all of this, I said, I think it would be nice to give to my regular Sunday school a video message. I'm doing that in the book of Revelation and in some of my other groups, but I thought maybe since I'm getting really comfortable with these videos, doing these videos, and why not do a study in the book of First John? So this morning, I'm going to try my first attempt at this. You can say this will be our introductory message to the book of First John. Now, as I have been studying about John himself, there's an interesting history about him. First of all, he is one of the first followers of Jesus. Remember the book of John, the Gospel of John? We see him first as a disciple of John, and John pointed Peter and Andrew and James and John to the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world, the Lamb of God. So we see immediately they left John and followed Jesus. And so John and James and Peter and Andrew were two of the first followers. I understand that John was the youngest of all the disciples. And if you to follow along, especially in his gospel, he never gives much attention to himself. He always referred to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. So he was very modest, and only in the book of Revelation does he make any mention of himself, and he did so when he referred that he was on the island of Patmos, so we know exactly who it was that God chose to give this message of revelation. Now, there are a lot of attempts to try to identify who John was in regard to the books that he wrote. Some commentators refer to him as John the Revelator. Another commentator describes him as John the Evangelist. He was truly John the Apostle, the brother of James. And so to keep things simple, we don't need to try to determine which John it was that wrote the epistle. It's the same John who wrote the gospel. It's the same John who had a brother named James. And there's no attempt on the part of John to try to hide himself, but he is a very modest man. He was quiet. He didn't try to call too much attention to himself. Now, talking about John, it's hard to understand when he wrote his epistle. You see, before he was banished to the island of Patmos by Domitian, he was in Ephesus. Now, some of the interesting history I read about John, I don't know how much of it is true, but it's interesting to express that John, while he was in Ephesus, Domitian came into power and started his great persecution. He destroyed his brother's family, who was Titus, the one who destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. About 1895 and 96, Domitian was in power, and at this time he banished John to the island of Patmos. Now, maybe he thought he was going to destroy John by putting him in there, since he had such an influence on the other Christians at that time. He was the leader, so Domitian decided to banish him to an island all by himself out in the middle of the ocean, where he had no contact with anyone, not realizing while he was in Patmos, God was about to give John his greatest book, the greatest information revealed in the book of Revelation. And as we studied Revelation, we talked about all of that. Now, there are various books written, history books like Fox's Book of Martyrs, and some books on church history that say that John was the only apostle who did not suffer a martyr's death. It was also confirmed that John was thrown into a boiling pot of oil. I don't know if it was Domitian that did this or someone else, but he miraculously escaped and was banished to the island of Patmos. Another interesting story is that one of the reasons that Domitian got rid of John was he was trying to parade himself as some type of god, and there were some people who were beginning to believe it was true. And so the presence of John at Ephesus created a great hindrance for him accomplishing this purpose. So he banished John to the Isle of Patmos because he would have stood out as a witness against him accomplishing this goal. Now, these are all ideas put out by different people concerning John, and I put them out as a matter of interest rather than fact. But as to when John wrote his epistle, it's hard to know. He was around 97 AD. He was taken off the island of Patmos after he wrote his book on Revelation, and he lived several more years as an old person. But I tend to think that maybe this epistle was written before he was banished to the island of Patmos. And I say that because I would think that after he received the message of Revelation, he might have said something about it in his epistles, but he didn't. So it's my understanding and my interpretation, the best way to put it, as this epistle was written prior to John being sent to the island of Patmos. And it was part of his ministry to the churches while he was still at Ephesus. So the epistles of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, I surmise, were written at that time. So I'm making this first venture today to attempt to do a series of studies in the book of 1st John. So with that, I will close this message and use this as an introduction to what is to follow. I think studying First John is a very exciting book. I'm interested in pursuing it. I've been meditating on it the last couple of days, and the Lord has given me some clear understanding, some interesting facts that I can share to you as we begin our study in this book. So we'll use this study today as the introduction to our book and the study on First John. I will see how the Lord directs as we pursue this particular study for our Sunday school and effective Bible study groups. Well, we'll see you later. I thought I would do this for today as an introduction to where I want to continue. See you later.